My fascination with lost films has always been a peculiar part of me, a badge I wore with odd pride. I watched Citizen Kane, The Godfather 1 and 2, and The Lawrence of Arabia over a weekend as a 9-year-old kid who was sick and feeble and suddenly found an enchanting world in the movies. Over the years, I got my hands on all the old classics, especially the ones made in the golden years of Hollywood. But there was one movie I had only heard whispers of here and there on internet forums, which created a minor controversy upon release and was immediately pulled out. That's how I stumbled upon the dark web listing for The Shadow Beyond, a film rumored to have been lost since its only screening in 1952, a screening that ended in tragedy when the audience was found in a state of inexplicable terror, some even driven to madness. My friend Alex, equally intrigued by the macabre and unexplained, agreed to watch it with me, oblivious to the horrors we were about to invite into our lives. We set up the projector in my dimly lit living room, the reels emitting a faint, musty scent that seemed to whisper of forgotten times. As the film crackled to life, we were greeted with scenes that seemed mundane at first. Shadowy figures lurking in alleyways, a procession of faceless people marching through a fog-shrouded city. But there was something unnervingly hypnotic about the way these figures moved, as if they were more than mere projections of light and shadow. "It's just a bunch of old film tricks." Alex tried to laugh it off, but his voice wavered, betraying his unease. "We've seen modern horror movies. This would pale in comparison." As the film progressed, the imagery grew more disturbing. Scenes of indescribable rites and grotesque figures twisted in agony flickered before us, their silent screams echoing in our minds. It was then that we noticed the air around us had grown colder, the shadows in the room deepening, creeping closer as if drawn by the flickering images. "Charlie, do you feel that?" Alex's voice was a mere whisper, his eyes fixed on the shifting shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of our vision. I could only nod, my throat tight with fear. The film had cast a spell over us, a connection to something ancient and malevolent. We should have stopped it then, should have heeded the warning signs. But we didn't. Our curiosity, that insatiable human flaw, kept us rooted in place, our eyes glued to the screen. That night, after Alex left, the real terror began. I tried to convince myself it was just the after effects of the film, my imagination running wild. But the shadows in my home seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes that defied the laws of physics. Whispers filled the air, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, yet filled me with an inexplicable dread. I barely slept, the few moments of rest plagued by nightmares that were too vivid, too real. Scenes from the film replayed over and over, but each time something from the shadows would turn its gaze directly at me, its eyes filled with a malevolence that chilled me to my core. The next day I called Alex, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, hoping he would tell me it was all in my head, but he didn't answer. When I finally reached him later that afternoon, his voice was strained, laced with fear. "Charles, something's wrong. I saw one of them today, in the daylight. It was watching me from across the street, just standing there in the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone, but I know what I saw." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I'd hoped what I experienced was a product of my own imagination, but Alex's encounter confirmed our shared nightmare was far from over. The days that followed were a descent into a nightmare we couldn't wake from. Alex and I tried to rationalize our experiences, to find a logical explanation for the shadows that seemed to stalk us, for the whispers that filled our ears with dread. But deep down, we knew we had tapped into something ancient, something evil, through the shadow beyond. One evening, as I sat alone trying to drown out the whispers with blaring music, I noticed a figure standing just outside my window. It was cloaked in shadows, its form barely distinguishable, but its presence was unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I slowly raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. There was no sound, but the message was clear. I was not alone. "Alex, it's getting worse," I confessed over the phone, my voice shaking. "He was outside my house tonight. I don't know what to do." "We have to find out more about the film," Alex replied, a determined edge to his voice. "There has to be a reason why this is happening. Maybe there's a way to stop it." His words sparked a flicker of hope, and we spent the next day scouring the internet and old film archives for any mention of the shadow beyond. Our search led us to an obscure film historian who had written a paper on lost films, including ours. He agreed to speak with us, his curiosity piqued by our desperation. The historian, a gaunt man with eyes that had seen too much, listened to our story with a grave expression. When we finished, he sighed, his gaze distant. "You're not the first to experience this," he began, his voice solemn. "The film was created by a cult in the early 50s, designed as a ritual to breach the veil between our worlds and the shadow realm. They believed they could control the shadows, use them for their own ends, but they were wrong. The shadows cannot be controlled, only unleashed." His words were a cold splash of reality. We had unleashed something we had no hope of controlling. "What can we do?" Alex asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The historian shook his head slowly. "The original reel was supposed to contain a ritual for sealing the breach, but it was lost before it could be used. Without it, I'm afraid there may be no way to close the door you've opened." That night, the shadows grew bolder, more aggressive. Whispers turned to screams, the darkness alive with malevolent intent. Alex and I huddled together in my living room, the only light from the flickering candles casting long, terrifying shadows across the walls. "We have to go back," I said, the realization dawning on me. "We have to watch the film again. There has to be something we missed, some clue on how to end this." Alex nodded, his face pale but resolute. We prepared ourselves, not knowing if we would survive the encounter, but knowing we had no other choice. The projector hummed to life, the opening scenes of The Shadow Beyond flickering onto the wall. We watched, our eyes scouring each frame for something, anything that might save us. But as the film reached its climax, something strange happened. The shadowy creature which was featured in it lifted a lamp and attacked the hero the first time that we watched it. But this time, it stopped in its tracks, turned, and it seemed like he looked at us. Suddenly, the room chilled to an unearthly cold, and in a second the creature leapt towards us, jumping out of the screen and into the real world. We screamed, but before it could reach us, we suddenly felt our blood pressure drop, and we passed out. When I woke up, everything was normal, but the reel automatically burnt off. The horror stopped that day, but what me and Alex saw that night, I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy.